Okay, so before we all freak out and smash the panic button, I want to pump the brakes for everyone right now and make it very clear that we are not currently in World War III. At least we aren't in World War III yet. World War III has been on everyone's mind for quite a bit though, especially since the war in Europe started. Who would fight in it? How would it begin? Where would it be fought? And who would ultimately come out on top are all things that experts are speculating on worldwide right now. Those are some of the things that we're going to look at in today's video. I do want to put a mild disclaimer right at the beginning of this video before we go further though. This is by no means a comprehensive guide on what is going to happen in World War III. It's certainly an interesting intellectual question to tackle, but there are ultimately so many variables involved that it's truly impossible to say one way or the other what is gonna happen. If a World War III ever did occur, then I can guarantee there would be countless events that nobody saw coming that would change the entire scope of how things would play out. But with all that being said, let's jump down the theoretical rabbit hole and see how this would all go down and what would happen if the United States lost. Well, first things first, we can't accurately answer that question until we understand a few things about the war in general first. Maybe the most important thing that we need to look at is who is going to be fighting in this war and what side they're going to be fighting on. Well, once again, if a World War III did happen, I wouldn't be shocked if some things changed. But based on the world's political climate right now, we can make a few assumptions on what each side would look like. Obviously, the United States would be taking part of this war, and if they're taking part of the war, then I think we can assume Russia would be taking part as well. And Russia would be on the opposite side to America. I think in a lot of people's simulations, these are the big players that would be pitted against one another in this World War III. Taking a look at who would be fighting alongside the Americans, we can make a solid educated guess at that as well. First off, there would be NATO and the countries that are involved in NATO. Some big and notable countries involved in this list would be Germany, the UK, France, Italy, Spain, and honestly many other ones too. Those are already a lot of powers fighting alongside the Americans, but they'd also get some more help as well. Canada, where I currently live, would assuredly be involved in fighting alongside the States. Israel is a known ally to the States and would definitely support them. Taiwan would certainly side with the countries that recognize them as an actual country, and considering they could be at the forefront of countries who start the actual war, they would definitely want the Americans' help. Japan would most likely be with this side as well. South Korea would want to fight with this side, and probably Saudi Arabia as well. Now I'm sure that there would be others involved as well, but these are just some of the big players alongside the Americans. On the opposing side with Russia, there would probably be fewer nations, but they'd definitely still be very strong. China would be the big one here. If Russia went to war with America, China would want to see the Russian side come out on top, and they definitely support them. And that's a massive ally on this side. North Korea would probably want to get involved as well, and they would be on this side. And Iran is also pretty tight with the Russians and would therefore want to work alongside this group too. Once again, there were probably some countries I'm missing here, but I think that this list gives us a general idea of what we're looking at. Now, if we are to continue down this rabbit hole, I think we need to make an important assumption about this war first. No nukes are involved. If nukes get involved, then it's very likely that nobody wins and the entire world just gets blown to smithereens, which would be bad for everyone. It also makes answering this question really easy because America would probably just be a radiation rubble wasteland and would probably resemble the map of Fallout 4. So, assuming there are no nukes, how does this thing play out, and what if America loses? Well, I feel like the Russian side would need to capture pretty much all of Europe to make this happen. I think that the way that they'd break America would be by choking out their economy and pretty much cutting off all trade partners that they have with Europe. Ultimately, by doing this, they would force America to surrender to them, and then they'd effectively have incredible influence over America. Here's where it gets tricky though. I don't think that these powers would ever go into America and invade it. That'd be extremely hard for these countries to do and be successful at. And frankly, if it did happen, then I feel like we're talking maybe even 100 years in the future and a lot of things would need to change. But just because they don't have feet on the ground doesn't mean that they wouldn't have incredible power. If they ended up having a chokehold over the economy, then America would have no choice but to do a lot of what they say. They would have incredible influence over what happens in the country and the way that everyday life is run. But how would that look exactly? Well, this is another thing that's hard to say because we really don't know who they are. If we assume that the countries I listed earlier are the ones engaged in this fight, then that means that there are at least 4 countries involved in defeating America and the rest of the world. So who's actually in control of the things that they conquer, and who calls the shots? I can guarantee that Russia would like to be the ones to do it, but I'm sure that every other country that was involved in the winning side would want that as well. I find it hard to believe that China would risk their troops, use their equipment, spend potentially billions of dollars in a World War III effort to then just play second fiddle to Russia and allow them to control everything and have influence over all of it. They would want a slice of this, and that's where things get confusing. A long time ago, we talked about what would happen if China took over the world on this channel. We talked about how the style of government would change, how the schooling and culture would shift to be more centered around China. But this would be a unique situation because it wouldn't just be China who took over the world. It would be multiple other countries too. I think it's fair to wonder then if the powers that ultimately win this World War III would then engage in a World War IV of their own. How would the resources acquired during this war be split up? There are truly only a few things that we can totally understand if America lost World War III. For starters, they would probably be forced to scale back their military by a hefty amount. How much so is hard to know for sure, but guaranteed it wouldn't be allowed to stay the way it is. Number 2 is that their global influence on the world would certainly be a lot less than it is now. Yes, their economy would be important, but their opinion on worldwide issues wouldn't hold nearly as much weight as it does right now. And third is that the culture would assuredly change in America. Now, we don't really know how it would change because we don't know who would eventually take over or have influence over America, but it assuredly would not be the same as it is right now. And I think that those are the only things that we can say with pretty much 100% assurity. After that, it gets really hard to speculate on what would happen to them because there's just way too many variables involved.
To be truthful, this is a bit of a difficult question to answer because a lot of it would depend on where the war begins, what it's over, and of course, I am not a fortune teller, so it's impossible to say for sure, but we can always look at the things we do know and draw whatever conclusions we wish. So let's do that. Firstly, where in our 2022 world would a world war likely break out, should it unfortunately come to that? I think the most obvious answer right now would be Russia or Ukraine. Of course, there has been conflict there for quite some time, and each day the tensions rise with more countries listening in and beginning to get involved, although carefully and conservatively. The real root of this conflict that is ongoing truly does stem all the way back to the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Ukraine, which is a former Soviet republic, went on to have the 3rd largest atomic arsenal in the world after the breakup of the Soviet Union. This led to both the United States and Russia working to denuclearize the country, and after coming to a series of agreements, Ukraine gave their nuclear warheads to Russia in exchange for security that would prevent them from a Russian attack. Then, flash forward to 2014, Russia invades Ukraine. The conflict has only risen, and it's become worse over time, however, and it really is about the future of Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin sees Ukraine as a place or a way that Russia can show its influence in Europe and really to the rest of the world, and he is seemingly willing to launch another invasion on the country at any time. But this time, unlike what happened in 2014, more people and more countries, including Ukraine itself, are prepared. In 2014, the US was slow to react to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This is because at the time, President Barack Obama was a little hesitant to react because he didn't want to escalate tensions with Russia. This led to the delay in the mobilization of diplomatic response in Europe, and Ukrainians were left without offensive weapons. That is not the case this time. In terms of this conflict at this point in time, both Russia and the US have drawn their lines in the sand. Russia presented the US with a list of demands that they had, and the US chose to reject some of those. US President Joe Biden is reportedly trying to renegotiate some of these terms, and includes some things that certainly would be of interest to Russia, such as the stationing of ground-launched missile systems in Ukraine or Eastern Europe, and this is all in an attempt to keep an all-out war from happening. One of the many on the list of demands was a ban on Ukraine from joining the NATO, something that both the US and the NATO itself rejected. Ukraine has a right to choose its own geopolitical alignments. Basically, this just scratches the surface on what is going on with that conflict right now, but experts are warning that the possibility of invasion is high, and invasion might mean the beginning of something that none of us want to see. Russia continues to deny that there is a planned attack, but there are currently about 130,000 troops fully equipped located right at Ukraine's border. So, if this is the beginning of the war, if this is how World War III begins, what will happen from there? Right now, there are talks of the growing positive relationship between China and Russia. This puts an interesting twist on things because right now, the three biggest military powers in the world are Russia, China, and the United States. China is agreeing with Russia, and it's also opposed to the expansion of the NATO, with Putin claiming that Western powers are using the NATO defense alliance to undermine Russia. Now, this is interesting because it also feeds into the current conflict that is going on in Taiwan. China's leader has been very vocal about how he believes that his path to national rejuvenation cannot be complete and successful until Taiwan unifies with the mainland, whether they want to or not, but Taiwan still insists that they are independent. So it's sort of similar to how Russia wants Ukraine, how Putin suggests that the Russian people and the Ukrainian people are all one, despite those in Ukraine not at all feeling the same. These two situations mirror each other on how the two leaders are willing to invade and even go to war to take over these unwilling territories, but the difference between them is that the People's Liberation Army really is going so strong and confident in their beliefs that, given their economic and military strength, should anyone else, including the US, choose to intervene, they doubt it would end up swaying them from their goal in the end. This would prove to be even more troublesome for the US, since if Taiwan were to fall into the hands of the Chinese government, the US would have a harder time defending its critical allies, Japan and the Philippines. This is all important because these similarities in situations might continue to draw Russia and China together if their bonding over wanting to dominate Western powers isn't enough. If the two were to sort of team up, for lack of a better way to put it, the US and the NATO in general might have a much harder time fighting back. Right now, the US is in a bit of a precarious place. Sending troops and resources to Taiwan takes them away from Ukraine, and vice versa. There's enough to go around, but it definitely spreads things thin, which is a lot less than ideal. This means that in order to protect both places, Europe needs to build up their own defense, and truthfully, since 2014, Ukraine has been doing just that. I mean, the NATO allies spend a lot more on their militaries than Russia does, and the US can bolster them with support and weapons, and they can still be committed to helping and defending, but in a more constrained capacity that would allow them to keep their focus elsewhere as well. I'm not saying that this is the best option, I'm just putting forward hypothetical scenarios. The worry is that China will use the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a window of US distraction in order to act and invade Taiwan. But the same could be said in the opposite scenario, so it's tough to find the right balance. Here's the thing. While those at the moment are the places and reasons where and why a world war could break out, we have to think of the logistics of it following that. If Russia and China were to team up together, that would be bad for the United States, but that does not mean that the two could just waltz into the United States, invade, and take claim. That is far from happening. The United States would be virtually impossible to invade. At the start of the war, not only would US forces come up to Canada, but they would also extend down south as well into Mexico. No chance of invading coastal US cities because of both submarine and air power. If invading from the north or the south, there would be miles of land and hundreds of people to get through first, which would end up depleting most of your resources before even getting to the US border. On the other hand, an invasion of Russia would be disastrous. Russia is huge. It's the same deal if someone tried to invade the US by coming through Canada. There is so much ground to cover. Most of your resources are going to be wasted just crossing the international distance and then the domestic distances just for an attack. So if invasion isn't really an option, that leaves one big scary option, and that is long distance weaponry. Of course, I'm talking about missiles and the like, and unfortunately with that comes the talk of nuclear weaponry. If we were simply talking about numbers like like spending budget, numbers in fleets, that sort of thing, we would only be talking about China and the US. In terms of spending and budget, the US defense budget sits at an approximate $705 billion in 2021, while China's defense spending in 2021 was a number of around $209 billion once converted into US dollars. So of course the US budget is way larger, but China does not have the high costs of paying an all-volunteer force, and China's military activities are largely focused on East Asia, while the US has a footprint all over the world. This means that while the gap in spending seems to be huge, it's not quite as large as it may appear on the surface. If we look into resources and warships, China is leading the US in terms of combat vessels. I mean, there are shipyards absolutely pumping out new warships on a weekly basis, but the turn of this is that while they have more, they are of lesser quality. US ships are ton for ton larger, they are better offensively and defensively, and they are manned by more experienced crews. This is all to say that both have their own advantages and disadvantages, and it's not exactly clear which one is just all out stronger and better or who would win over the other. While the idea of Russia and China is definitely a terrifying one for us in the Western world, it's important to note the allies of the US who would be extremely helpful in the war. The US has a larger network of allies than China does. In Asia, this means Japan, the third largest economy in the world. It means Australia, who brings very capable naval forces. This means South Korea, Singapore, and many others, but one of the curveballs is likely to be India. For years, India hasn't been on the list of top and most powerful militaries, but that is very quickly changing. Very soon, India is definitely on track to become a military superpower. In fact, India is number 4 when it comes to the strongest militaries in the world, and they are in the midst of a total overhaul, which is doing a lot to strengthen their forces. There's plans being made to integrate the Navy and the Air Force, and doing so would make these unified armed forces easier for the US, the UK, and Australia to team up with as well. While China has the largest standing army in the world at 2.1 million troops, an allyship with India would give the US a much needed upper hand, considering they are second with 1.2 million ground troops and another 960,000 reserve officers. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that it's tough to say who would win World War III should it ever come to that. I mean, truthfully, no one really wins a war. Everyone is depleted by the end. Resources are scarce, economies take a hit, and there is a drastic loss of life, which should always be avoided at all costs. It's also important to note that with the likelihood of a mass amount of nuclear weapons being used in a third world war, it's possible that no one will win, because there might not be anyone left. I think that should nuclear power not entirely destroy our world, the US is likely to come out on top. Since I live in the Western world, there is possibly bias in that answer, but I truly do believe that the allyships and relationships with other countries would give us the upper hand when it comes to a world war. Russia is powerful and scary, but one country's allyship does not a world war win. All eyes are on Ukraine, as just hours ago, while Russian President Vladimir Putin actively denied an invasion into Ukraine, he also was authorizing a quote special military operation and began sending troops and airstrikes into Ukraine. We've been watching these tensions rise, and it's led up to this moment for weeks and months, so let's take a step back and review the timeline that really led us to this point. While we could really go back quite far, let's take it back for now to 2013. In November of that year, the Ukrainian government made a decision to suspend the signing of partnership agreements with the European Union to avoid straining ties with Russia. At that point in time, Ukraine was under leadership by their 4th president, Viktor Yanukovych. He had previously also served as the prime minister, but once his decision came to reject the Ukrainian-European Association Agreement, Ukrainian citizens began to revolt. He explained that this decision was made with pressure from Russia, and that this decision to turn against what would have opened borders to goods and created easier travel between Europe and Ukraine was because he could not afford to sacrifice trade with Russia, who of course was opposed to this deal. The former Ukraine president also said that an EU offer to lend Ukraine 610 million euros was inadequate, and that it would need at least 20 billion euros a year to upgrade the Ukrainian economy to quote European standards. Many people didn't like these answers for the deal rejection, and instead believed it was because their president was pro-Russia rather than being pro-Ukraine, and didn't really have their best interest at heart. Thousands of people swarmed the streets of Kiev, with some explaining explaining that the decision to walk away from the agreement was, quote, stealing their dream of living in a normal country. These protests led in February of 2014 to Ukraine's parliament voting to dismiss then-President Yanukovych and set early elections. Unrest continued in Ukraine, however, as the former president fled from the capital ahead of an impeachment vote. Protesters began to take control of Capitol buildings, and on the same day, Parliament voted that the president could be relieved of his duties in a 328-0 vote. The former president went on to say that the vote was illegal and possibly coerced, and he asked the Russian Federation for assistance. Because of this, Russia saw the situation as an illegal coup and did not recognize the interim government. Protests both in support of and against the revolution were now happening in both eastern and southern Ukraine, and the escalating tensions caused a Russian military invasion and the establishment of the self-proclaimed proto-states Donetsk and Luhansk. During this Russian military invasion on March 18th of 2014, Russia invaded with unmarked forces and formally annexed Crimea and the federal city of Sevastopol as the 84th and 85th federal subjects of Russia. But despite this, Crimea was considered by most countries of the world in a UN resolution of March 2014 to remain part of Ukraine, but Crimea is now part of Russian territory. After this, the interim Ukrainian president Arseniy Yatsenyuk proceeded to sign the EU association agreement. After this, in a landslide election, Ukraine welcomed a new president, Petro Poroshenko, and in September of 2014, he and local armed groups in eastern Ukraine signed a series of agreements, the first being the Minsk Protocol, which was essentially a ceasefire with Belarus. This seemed like an important step forward because it saw representatives from Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe all speaking and having talks about possible solutions to the crisis. This new Ukrainian government also went on to restore the 2004 amendments to the Ukrainian constitution that were deemed unconstitutional in 2010 by the former government, and initiated a purge of civil servants who were associated with the former regime. In December of 2014, the Ukrainian parliament renounced Ukraine's non-aligned status with the aim of deepening the connection and relationship with NATO, and by February of 2015, leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France all announced a new peace deal with Minsk. This brings us to just a few years ago in 2019 when the Ukrainian parliament passed a constitutional amendment stating Ukraine's commitment to joining NATO. This was announced much to the dismay of course, Russia. While this was the next major step in the timeline of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it is important to note that throughout this entire time, there has been conflict and unrest in eastern Ukraine. Since the fighting in Ukraine began, Russia has been denying any sort of responsibility and has been claiming to be an active bystander rather than actually being a party to the conflict. This was not only frustrating to the current Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, but others began feeling the need to get involved as well. This led to last year, in March of 2021, foreign ministers of the G7 nations Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US to all release a joint statement which made known their impatience at Russia's attempted deceptions. The statement said, quote, "Russia is a party to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, not a mediator." In November of last year, satellite imagery was showing a new buildup of Russian troops on the border of Ukraine, and Kiev was giving news that Moscow had mobilized 100,000 soldiers with tanks and other military hardware. By December 7th, 2021, US President Joe Biden was warning Russia of the impending and sweeping Western economic sanctions that would be imposed should they choose to go ahead with the Ukraine invasion. On December 10th of 2021, the Russian Foreign Ministry demanded, quote, legal guarantees that NATO wouldn't expand eastward, and by the 17th, they had presented detailed security demands to the West, including that NATO ceases all military activity in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, and that the alliance never accept Ukraine or other former Soviet nations as members. This now brings us into January of 2022, with both the US and Ukrainian presidents speaking on the phone about how the US will intervene should tensions continue to rise. All the while, troops are lining up at the border. Putin is swearing that no invasion is going to happen. He's actually mocking Western society as he does it. Just over a week ago, he was claiming to have withdrawn troops to show us or prove that the talks of a potential war that were going on in the Western world were not only false but seemingly hysterical. The Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said herself, quote, "February 15th, 2022 will go down in history as the day Western war propaganda failed, humiliated and destroyed without a single shot fired." And a spokesman for the Russian government asked reporters if the, quote, "exact time of the start of war" had been published. Everything coming out of the mouths of officials in Russia was a direct contrast to what we were seeing on the ground actively. This has all brought us to what has happened in the last few days. On February 21st, 2022, the Russian Security Council held a meeting where Putin signed 2 decrees recognizing Lugansk and Donbass as independent and sovereign states, and at a ceremony held in the Kremlin, he also penned the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance between Russia and the 2 regions. Throughout this, many UN representatives urged for both, quote, "peaceful settlement" and, quote, "reasonable solutions." Today, on February 24th, 2022, Putin went forward and authorized a, quote, "special military operation" in Donbass. In a televised address, he said, quote, "Our plans do not include the occupation of Ukrainian territories. We are not going to impose anything on anyone by force." He went on to claim that this move was simply a response to the, quote, "fundamental threats" of NATO, which has expanded to Eastern Europe and brought its military infrastructure closer to Russian borders. According to the Russian defense minister, the Russian forces are destroying, quote, "military infrastructure, air defense facilities, military airfields, aviation of the Ukrainian armed forces with high-precision weapons and not targeting Ukrainian cities." Putin has said, quote, "We urge you to lay down arms immediately and go home. I will explain. All servicemen of the Ukrainian army who comply with this requirement can freely leave the area of military actions and return to their families." But he also urges others not to intervene, saying, quote, "Whoever would try to stop us and further create threats to our country, to our people, should know that Russia's response will be immediate and lead you to such consequences that you have never faced in your history. We are ready for any outcome." That is exactly why the situation is both extremely precarious and terrifying. Putin also claimed that the goal of this invasion was the demilitarization and the, quote, "denazification" of Ukraine. This came as a shock to Ukrainian President Zelensky, who asked just hours earlier how a people who lost 8 million of its own citizens fighting Nazis could support Nazism. Also, as a Jewish man himself, he asked, how could he be a Nazi? Right now, the invasion appears to be happening by land, sea, and air. Zelensky has said in a tweet that, quote, "Russia has embarked on a path of evil, but Ukraine is defending itself. Ukraine has now imposed martial law and severed all diplomatic relations with Russia, saying that weapons will be given to anyone who wants them." In opposition to the claims from Russia of only attacking military bases, so far dozens of people have been killed, including civilians. Right now, a number of NATO allies who share borders with Russia have agreed to launch consultations under NATO's Article 4 under the Defensive Alliances Treaty. Estonia's Prime Minister said, quote, "Russia's widespread aggression is a threat to the entire world and to all NATO countries." Many leaders are speaking out to support Ukraine and condemn Russia, but it has become clear that words and sanctions, and even the threat of continued and harsher sanctions, aren't enough. It certainly is tough to say what exactly is going to happen from here, but the truth is that right now, the future is very uncertain and absolutely terrifying.